Hi, I'm Matt Culkin, co-chair of Steptoe's Financial Services Group, and welcome to Steptoe Financial Services University. We're pleased to present a series of short, focused conversations with my colleagues from our firm's various practice groups and offices around the world. Today, we're going to talk about legislative tax policy. I'm joined by one of my colleagues, George Callas, who's a managing director in our government affairs and public policy practice based in Washington. George, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Matt, for inviting me. Happy to be here.
So before we start, I think it's important that you establish your credentials, which are quite impressive. If you could, please just tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure, happy to. I've been at Steptoe since July of 2018, so a little over 2 years. As Matt mentioned, I'm managing director in the government affairs and public policy group. I'm also secondarily in the tax group and the tax policy group, which bridges the two, basically. Before I came over to Steptoe, I spent the previous 15 years roughly on Capitol Hill, both the House and Senate side in various capacities, but the bulk of my time there was as a senior tax staffer. I spent almost 7 years at the House Committee on Ways and Means, which has jurisdiction over tax policy in the House, ultimately as the chief tax counsel over there. And then my last roughly 2.5 years on Capitol Hill, I went over with Paul Ryan to the Speaker's office and served him in his role as Speaker as his senior tax counsel, where I helped, among other responsibilities and other negotiations, helped negotiate the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the end of 2017, which we think of as tax reform. Before my 15 years on Capitol Hill, I was at a Big Four accounting firm for a few years. And before that, I was getting some degrees at the University of Florida, so I'm a Gator as well.
We won't hold that against you. So I want to talk first again about sort of the tax writing process. I think for folks outside of Washington, you see it on the news at the last step, and so it may have the appearance of being something that came together pretty quickly, but that's not actually how it works. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about the process itself.
That's absolutely right. So, I mean, we often, on Capitol Hill, we often describe big legislation, and in particular tax legislation, which is where most of my experience is, as the path is following a hockey stick shaped graph where it's moving very slowly but upwards for a long period of time, and then at a certain point it suddenly spikes upwards and steeply, and the deal gets done. I think what most people see, they only see the last part of the hockey stick after the bend. They don't see the months and oftentimes years of work that goes into getting you to that point to that inflection point where it can all come together. And part of that is just what the press focuses on. If it's a partisan piece of legislation, not bipartisan, then the other party always has an incentive to play that up and accuse the other side of rushing it through at the last minute. And so people just generally aren't aware of all the work that goes into it. Opponents of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was enacted in December of 2017, described it as a 6-week process. I would say that the first public hearing on tax reform that led to that legislation was actually in January of 2011. So just about a 7-year process rather than a 6-week process. And the tax writing process in particular is a very iterative process, and the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, which have jurisdiction over taxes, as well as the Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, which is a repository of expertise in Congress for the tax writers, they see themselves as guardians of the tax code and guardians of good tax policy. They don't want to just throw things in there that will create huge loopholes, or in the other direction that could inadvertently blow up business models because they don't realize what they're doing. And so they're very careful, and they spend a lot of time behind the scenes working on policies, and usually the policies that end up in a deal are policies that really went through an extensive vetting process for months and sometimes many years before there was agreement that to include those in a piece of legislation. And so that's why, folks who are trying to influence the tax writing process, it's very, very hard these days to just kind of airdrop in when the deal, the I's are being dotted and the T's are being crossed on a deal, and either ask for your priority to be included or ask for something you don't like to be removed. It's very hard to do that at the last second if you haven't been laying the foundation and laying brick for a long time, educating members of Congress, educating the committees, including the staffs, and getting them comfortable with your views and why you have those views and what the potential consequences are. You need to get in there early, and again, in some cases, years in advance, if you want your views to kind of seep in to the congressional consciousness when later on the deal is being done.
Yeah, I've heard people both, I think this is true outside of the tax context. People refer to it as a long-term investment. It's spending the time engaging and educating. It may not be a one-for-one transactional benefit, but it's something where you plant the seed for future harvest.
That's right. And I think, in this day and age, both because of increasing polarization, because of this sort of growing kind of populism where there is skepticism about, tax provisions that favor large businesses, investors, et cetera. In particular, though, financial services companies, politically, this obviously isn't accurate in the real world, but politically, oftentimes those who want to either find an easy target or block something that an industry wants will refer to the financial services industry as Wall Street. And that's a pejorative term in politics, unfortunately, these days. And so, it's easier not to help people out with their needs if you're going to be attacked for help, for helping out Wall Street, for example. If you want people who would otherwise be sympathetic to you on Capitol Hill to help you out, you need to not only get them comfortable with what you're doing, get them prepared, and build support over a very long period of time so that they're willing to take the political risk and they know how to push back against the attacks and so forth. And that's not something you do in days or weeks. Again, that takes months or years.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned financial services specifically, and we've talked a little bit about the long game here. How do you think about both the threats, you've sort of alluded to this already, but also opportunities, right? So there's some defense, but also some offense for financial services companies, financial services specific tax policies. What do you see when you survey the landscape?
Right. I think there are both threats and opportunities for the financial services industry with respect to tax legislation. I think there's probably right now in 2020 and for the next few years more threats than opportunities. 2017, the 2017 law significantly cut the corporate rate, made a number of other favorable changes for corporations in general, and for other funds and investors and so forth. And so with that done, much of it is just sort of defending what was accomplished and not allowing it to be reversed in a way that is adverse to taxpayers, particularly in the financial services industry. But there are opportunities for further improving the tax code. There certainly were mistakes and unintended consequences in the 2017 law, and there's a lot of work that can be done fixing those mistakes. Again, some of them were true technical corrections where there was literally a drafting error. Others are more just unintended consequences of policies where the Congress didn't really understand how that would affect the industry or particular taxpayers. And so there is an opportunity, I think, to play offense on continuing to improve the tax code that was reformed in 2017 by getting. I always refer to the 2017 tax reform as like a new model year for a car. When a car comes out, when a car company comes out with a new model of a Mustang or whatever it is, it's brand new. The body looks different. It's got all these different things. That first model year, there's always bugs in it. And you got to spend time the next few years then trying to work out those bugs. It doesn't, just because there's bugs doesn't mean you don't keep developing new, more advanced models of a car. And that's, the 2017 law was a really important, necessary, positive achievement, but it's got bugs in it. And there are, I think, opportunities, again, in the coming years to work on fixing those bugs. As far as the threats are concerned, cutting the corporate rate from 35 to 21, well, the political pressure is kind of upward on that. There are many, especially on the Democratic side of the aisle, who want to push that 21% up. They want to tighten, and these are provisions that apply broadly, not just to financial services. They want to really tighten the screws. Some people on the international tax rules and tax foreign earnings of U.S. multinationals and funds more heavily. And then there are industry-specific tax policy threats, like a financial transactions tax, like the old Obama bank tax from 10 years ago, which Vice President Biden it didn't get done then, but Vice President Biden has resurrected it now, a tax on banks and other financial institutions with assets over 50 billion or however they decide to measure it. So, both industry-specific and general tax provisions that present threats, but at the same time you're trying to defend against the threats, there's kind of opportunities to open the hood and try to improve some of those pieces that have bugs in them.
So I really like your analogy about a new body style on the new year model of a car. In my practice, it is probably the case that each year they tinker with the legislation, but it's really the regulator that has the discretion to interpret and implement. I'm wondering how you see the division of labor between Senate Finance, House Ways and Means, the White House, Treasury, the IRS. How do you see the different pressure points, the different avenues or opportunities to advocate, and how do you think about strategically where you should be spending your energy?
Right. So that's a great question. The short answer is all of the above. Right. I mean, tax legislation, it runs the gamut. Right. Some can be very detailed and prescriptive, and other provisions can have ambiguities all over the place. You don't, generally get the broad delegations of rulemaking authority that you might get in other subject matter areas where the agencies are basically just given a mandate to figure it out. In some cases, with some provisions, you might get, fairly broad instructions to Treasury to promulgate regulations, but they're not necessarily as broad as some other areas of law. Having said that, tax law is very complicated. It's very complex. There's no way for the folks in Congress to anticipate every transaction in the global economy and how a general law they write is going to apply to transactions that they never even knew happened. That existed, and millions and millions and millions, probably billions, probably of transactions, and there's just no way to anticipate all of that, especially when you have when technology and industries and business models and global supply chains often change much faster than Congress can change the law. And so a lot is left to Treasury and the IRS work hand in glove on promulgating guidance. They do work together closely on it. A couple of years ago, there was a new wrinkle added when OIRA at OMB was granted more authority to oversee tax regulations. They don't generally write them, but they review what Treasury and the IRS has done, and they can slow things down, and they can ask questions, and they can suggest changes. And so that brings the White House into it, because OIRA is not just OIRA. OIRA is the White House. It's OMB, it's the NEC, it's the National Economic Council, it's the Domestic Policy Council. It's really any office in the White House and the executive office of the president that has an interest in a particular policy can use OIRA as a vessel to get involved and try to influence the rulemaking process, the guidance process. And so that really does expand the potential universe of folks that you need to get in and talk to beyond the, traditionally at the regulatory level, it was just Treasury and maybe IRS. But now it's all these other power centers that are generally affiliated with the executive office of the president, who may or may not decide to get involved in any particular issue and who can influence the process.
Well, we've certainly gone a lot further than Schoolhouse Rock today. So thank you for coming on to talk about financial services and tax policy issues.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate the opportunity.
So as a reminder, you can catch more of our Financial Services University episodes and learn more about our financial services practice at steptoe.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.